Hey everyone, welcome to the presentation. Let me get my screen share up. There we go. All right. I'm also going to keep chat open on another screen. So if you have any questions at all, just drop them in the chat. If I don't see it right away, I know Annie will chime in. But I'll try to keep everything under an hour, so I'm not taking up too much of your time. I could just go on for days, but no one has time for that. Welcome. My name's Kevin Griffin. This is Better Object Mapping in .NET with Dapper. And we're going to talk a little bit about databases and relating database objects to actual objects inside of C#. So those who don't know me, and over on your side of the pond, you probably haven't heard of me too much because I don't travel too much outside of the U.S., but I'm from the United States, from Virginia specifically. I'm a Microsoft MVP. My focus is in ASP.NET, ASP.NET Core, and developing apps on Microsoft Azure. So as an independent consultant, if anyone needs help on their team just getting up and running, or you just need help getting something out the door, let me know. I also offer regular training and coaching services. I'm on Twitter. That's the best place to contact me afterwards. Twitter.com/1KevGriff. And on my website, consultwithgriff.com, I usually post on all the different things that I'm talking about. So Dapper in particular has its own site. So consultwithgriff.com/Dapper. All this content and more as I start answering everyone's questions, because I get a lot of the common questions doing this talk, and some of them aren't covered in this talk. So I'm trying to write posts for the common questions that I get that I don't have necessarily good answers for, or at least answers that we can't answer in the allotted amount of time. I do see in the chat, Andrew, we met at NDC. That was such a good conference, and fun fact, that was my first time in England, which was a ton of fun. And I'm glad I got to go before the entire world shut down. And it was nice to come back and say, all right, well, I got that last big travel engagement out of my system, and now I'm not going to go anywhere for the next couple of years. So what is object mapping? I'm going to talk about object mapping quite a bit. And object mapping is pretty simple. If you do anything with relational databases, that's being SQL Server, MySQL, Postgres, you name it, you understand that when you make a query to a relational database, you get back kind of this flat structure, this table structure of a whole bunch of columns, and it has a whole bunch of data. But this data on itself isn't useful. You need to move it over to an actual object. Because I'm assuming if you're a .NET group, you're using C#, you want everything in objects because objects are useful. But raw database results are not useful at all. And it's really hard doing it, getting information from a raw database result and putting it into an object that you can actually use. So what do I mean? Well, let's get into some nitty-gritty code. If I make a select statement on a SQL database, so here's an easy one. Select ID, first name, last name, email address, date of birth from a table called users. Well, that's going to return all the user data that I want, but that's not useful. What's useful is the object application user where I have my ID, first name, last name, email address, date of birth. Well, I need to get the data from the SQL result into an object or a set of objects that I can actually go do something with. And if I were doing this the hard way, if I were doing this the way that I did it back in 2007, how would that code look? Well, here's an example. And I didn't used to have this example code in the talk, but someone came to me and said, you really should show the hard way, because if you don't, no one's going to appreciate the Dapper way or the easy way. So let's start at the top. We define our SQL. What are we going to call the database with? If you've done any ADO work at all, you are probably getting the shivers right now, because this is really complicated code. And this is a simple example. We could get more complicated if we wanted to. Well, first thing we have to do is we have to create our connection, and we have to open our connection. So a big thing I see people forget to do is that they don't properly dispose of their connections or dispose of their readers. So that memory just takes up space, and you run into memory leaks. Well, you create your connection, you open it, you have to create a reader. So the reader goes to the database and says, here's my query. Give me something that I can read from to read back all the results. Because it's not going to give you all the results immediately. It's going to give you one row at a time. So we're like, all right, well, let's create our empty list of users that we're going to populate. And then we'll iterate, while the reader has rows in it. And for each row that we iterate on, we're going to create a new user. But to populate the data in that user, we have to go to the reader and say, all right, well, give me the first position or the 0th position. And I'm expecting that to be a long or an N64. And I want to assign that as my ID. And then first name, I'm expecting that to be the first position. Then I'm expecting last name to be the 2nd position, and so on. And you have to know a couple of things up front. You have to know which position, which ordinal position your elements are at. You have to know the data type, and you have to get all that stuff correct. I mean, one of the things you could do is you could say, well, let's ask the reader what ordinal position the column ID is, and then you could cache that stuff away. I'm not saying this is optimized code in any way, shape, or form, but this is kind of the hard way of doing it. So we go through every user in our list. Now, if we have 100 users, it's pretty quick. If I have 1 million users, it takes a little bit of time. And when we're all done, we can return that list of users, and everything gets disposed of properly. But this is actually really efficient code. It's fast code because we're getting into the result set and creating our objects. There's another, quote, hard way of doing it, and I don't recommend this, but this is slightly easier, and that's using a data table. Data tables have been in .NET forever, since the early ADO 2.0 days. It's the same process. You create your connection, you open your reader, and instead of reading everything bit by bit, you create a data table, and you load the reader into the data table. And this actually gives you a very simple multi-dimensional array where you could go to a row, 0, 100, 1,000, and you can get an element by its ordinal name, so email address or first name. And this is really cool. However, data tables are memory hogs, and I have crashed many an application by trying to put too much data into a data reader and then trying to manipulate, into a data table, and then manipulate that data table. Fun fact, when I first started doing .NET development, 2007, I was kind of out of college, went into a consulting company, and they were doing C#, and the project I got on had 2 folks working on it. One of the guys, he was the chief engineer, the chief architect. He didn't really have a fancy title. He was just the guy that built the project. And we got in, we started looking at some of the database code, and all I saw were data tables all over the place. So I kind of just thought that's how you did database work inside of .NET. And it wasn't until probably 6, 9, 12 months later, I started learning about alternatives to doing database work in .NET. And I ended up going back and rewriting a ton of his data table code to make them more efficient. And yeah, so you could do this. Not saying you should. Now, there's a lot of other ways to do this sort of mapping work. And I'm not going to talk about all of them. I just want to mention there are other alternatives. Any framework, that's kind of the most popular one. That's the one that Microsoft says, if you're doing database work at all and you're a developer, you should use any framework. Now, I'm just going to kind of stand back for a second and say, I am not the biggest fan of any framework for anything you want to put into production. I have a lot of reasons for that, and that's a great conversation over a pint, but not for this talk. And I'll hang around afterwards if you want to talk about why I don't like any framework. There's also in Hibernate. This is a solution that's been available for a very long time. It was based off of Hibernate, which was Java based, and still does the same thing. There are micro RMs like Massive, Petapoco, and the list can go on. There's a variety of flavors of object relational mappers that do all this simple stuff in slightly different ways. I like Dapper, and that's why I talk about it. And Dapper is a very simple object mapper for .NET. A couple key points about Dapper. It's a micro ROM, meaning it's not going to generate any SQL for you. Compare this to any framework, which is a full ORM. It's going to not just create your select statements, your inserts, or updates. It's going to create your dang database for you because that's what any framework does. I think you're better off not having the tool write SQL for you, because I have worked on a number of projects where any framework for anything other than a simple insert or update can write extremely complicated code. And it's not necessarily any framework's fault. It's the developer that's running the interactions with any framework. That's not to say that a very good, competent any framework developer couldn't write more efficient code than just writing raw SQL. But I have grown up with SQL. I know how to write good SQL. I know how to optimize SQL. And I know what databases are good at. So I try to use the strengths of the database to offset some of my crappy code. And, with any framework, you can't do that. But with Dapper, you can, because you're providing everything that the database is going to do. It doesn't generate the database. Again, your code shouldn't dictate what your database looks like. I still will stand on that soapbox all day. I think you probably know what your database should look like. If you have taken even a half an hour of database design, you're probably as competent to create databases as any framework. But 9 times out of 10, I am going on the teams that have database professionals that understand how to build tables and relationship. They understand things like normalization, indexes. They can build a good database and they can optimize a good database. When you have code that's generating it for you, you're taking so much of that power out of your own hands that, I'd rather not do that. And then there are also cases where you're going into a project that the database was created so long ago, trying to create the mappings and just tools fight against each other. Dapper provides a fluent interface for mapping data readers to objects. And that really means we have our code earlier where I open a reader, but let's take that reader and let's just get back a list of objects. What if the tool could just do all that work for us? That's what Dapper tries to do. And everything I'm talking about is just going to be extension methods off of a SQL connection. Now, I'm going to do all my examples in SQL Server, but you could use anything that has an ADO.NET provider. So SQLite, SQL CE, Firebird, Oracle, MySQL, and Postgres. Those all have ADO.NET providers in them and can be used with Dapper. And probably my favorite part, and this is the reason I took it seriously many years ago, is that it was generated by the folks at Stack Overflow. And you probably have heard of Stack Overflow. It's one of like the 5 most popular websites on the entire internet. These guys and gals serve up millions and millions of requests per second. Someone is always searching on Stack Overflow for something. And I like to think that the folks who are serving up that many requests per second, they care deeply about performance and doing things as quickly and as simply as possible. So you'll learn, if you read the Stack Overflow engineering blocks, they have built several of their own tools strictly for performance and trying to get the most out of .NET without having to add too much ceremony on top of it. Dapper is the end result of one of those initiatives. So Dapper is heavily used inside of Stack Overflow. And I'm kind of the point of, if it's good enough for Stack Overflow, one of the most popular websites on the internet, it's good enough for me. And that's one of the biggest reasons that I have dove very deeply into Dapper. Let's see, Andy, if I am using handcrafted SQL, how would I make that testable? That is a great question. And I'm not going to cover testing in this particular talk, but you're looking at the that's a much longer conversation than I can have right now. But yeah, definitely a process for doing that. All right, how does it work? Dapper is just a NuGet package. And you go in NuGet, you type in Dapper, and there's going to be a couple other little packages here. So you'll see Dapper Contrib. There's also a couple sets of Dapper extensions. I don't do that much work with the Contrib package, but there are a lot of useful little tidbits in there that I highly recommend you go through and you take a look if you're going to take Dapper seriously. Everything I'm going to show tonight is just core Dapper, because I want to show you some of the basics. And I'm not going to dive too deep into a lot of edge cases. Dapper is not meant to be a complicated tool with a lot of, well, what if I want to cover this case or that case or this case? It's meant to solve the 80% problem. Like, all right, 80% of the work I do, Dapper is going to take care of flawlessly. The other 20%, you might have to bend a little, but really there's no such thing as a perfect tool. That's why I approach Dapper. On the left side of the screen, I have just some basic code. I'm actually going to walk through this process live because it's really simple to do. You're creating a connection, you're taking your SQL string, and then you're just calling the connection, telling it, here's the SQL I want to execute. Can you please give me that back as a list of users or a list of whatever data type you want to map to? But let's dive into some actual code. All right, let me bring over my, I forgot to bump my font up. I'll take care of that real fast. I bumped it up over in SQL Server, but I didn't bump it up here. There we go. All right, there we are. That should be a little bit easier to read. So one of the things I did for this talk is I actually created a new database. I was originally trying to use the AdventureWorks database, and turns out that's a horrible database to do anything with. There's a ton of data in it, but to show off a couple simple examples, this is not the best way to go. So for our cases, here's what I want to do. I have my database, and let's see, I can zoom in. Why is my zoom not working? All right. I'm not sure if the Zoom is working over Zoom, so if it's not, yell at me. But I have two tables. I have a person's table and I have a phone table. And these tables have columns in them. And it's a very basic table. ID, first name, last name, middle name, date of birth, and last login date. The big thing I want to show here is that they're different properties. They have different data types. So int, or ID, is a big int. First, middle, last name are all bar chars of a certain size. Date of birth is just a date, but last login date is a date-time offset. So it's going to be saved along with a time zone. So there's a lot of different data types here. Let me zoom out. And what I want to do is I want to just make a simple query to this database. I want to tell it, give me all the persons, all the people back as a collection. And what does a person look like? Well, this is a person. And I didn't clean it up for this demo, but date of birth, last login date, and I also have phone, but we're not going to talk about phone yet. That's a little bit later in another demo. So I just want to take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can also get back ID. So we can say long ID. And what would that SQL statement look like? All right, here we go. So let's just select everything. ID, first name, last name, from persons, and that's going to return, it's going to return a lot. How many? I have 5,000 people in here I've generated. I'm going to copy that SQL statement, go over into my app, and I've preset up this database where I'm just going to make an API call. It's going to connect to my SQL server, and caveat, you don't do this type of work inside your controller. This should always be in some sort of other library, but this is a demo, so I'm going to do it inside of the controller. I'm going to connect to my SQL server, and I'm just going to say, well, give me a list of persons. I'll say, all right, connection, let's query. And query is a generic. So I can tell it, well, this is going to return a list of persons, and I'm going to pass in some SQL. What's that SQL look like? Here we go. So closer to what we were doing the hard way, but I'm not writing any of that mapping code. Let's walk through this. The SQL statement I'm going to make, let's generate the connection. Let's query the connection. Now there's a couple things I'm not doing here. I'm not opening the connection. Dapper's smart enough to check the status of the connection. Is it open or is it closed? If it's closed, it's going to open the connection for you, make the query. It's going to take the result set, iterate through that result set, create instances of a person, and then this comes back as a list of persons. And if I remember to await it, if we look at the tooltip, it says it's returning an IEnumerable. So it's going to return a list of persons. Well, I can take these persons and then just return it out to whatever's making the call. And I can probably comment that out for the rest of this demo. Well, let's go ahead and set a breakpoint. Run this example. I bring over my window. All right. So I'll go to API/Dapper, hit my breakpoint, and we'll see, boom, boom, boom. My persons, there's 5,000 inside of it. And if I return those, it's going to return, it's going to format it. All right, so it's going to return everything. We see, all right, it's coming back first name, middle name, last name. Date of birth is coming back. So it's a date object in the database, meaning there's no time associated with it. So I'm getting back the date, but .NET doesn't have a concept of just a date object. It's always a date time. So it's always going to be midnight. No big deal. Last login date is fun because last login date is the date, the time, but also the offset. So where in the world was the person that logged in? I have kind of become fascinated lately with daytime offsets because I've been doing a lot of time zone based work. And I appreciate this coming back from the database because doing conversion on a daytime offset is pretty easy if you know the time zone that it was generated in. So this is pretty cool. So it's all coming back as the data type that we expect it to be. And I think that's the important part. Now, a couple other things that I made middle name, and I didn't show you this, but if we look at our persons, we can see middle name is a nullable. Everything else is not null, but middle name can be null because some folks don't have middle names. Well, we could in our database say, well, it's not null, but if they don't have a middle name, just make it an empty string. That's one way to solve the problem. Or you can make it null, and because string is a nullable type, oh, the formatter crashed. Oh, well. So let's just zoom in here. You can see this instead. We can see that middle name is null. So it automatically handles our nulls for us. If we were doing this mapping by hand, one of the things we would have to do is we couldn't just check to see if it was null. We would have to check to see if it was for DB null which is a different type of null. And if that was true, then we would assign middle name as null. But you have to do a little bit of extra work to support those cases. But Dapper does it all for you. That's what's nice and easy. Let's go ahead and close this. All right. So that's one part of the picture. I'm just doing a simple select statement, and I'm mapping it to an object. I know what you're sitting there thinking, Kevin, this is one example, but I tend to use where clauses or some sort of parameters in my queries. How do we do that sort of thing here? Well, let's talk about what that query looks like. What if I want to look for all persons where their date of birth is greater than, let's say, the year 2000. So I can type in a date in here. There's 1,500 people who were born after 2000 in this database. All right. Well, I need to put this into my Dapper query. So I can add that. And I know what you're yelling at the screen, like, Kevin, don't hard code your parameters. Let's pass in a parameter. Okay. Well, we'll create one called date of birth. And this uses a SQL style syntax. If I was creating parameters in my SQL script, I would say declare date of birth as a date, and I could assign it something if I want to. And then later come down here and I could use date of birth as a parameter. We'll take that same concept and we'll move back over to Dapper. I can just add a placeholder here. I'm going to have a parameter called date of birth. And then in the query, we'll go ahead and say, we'll add a date of birth. So we'll say new datetime. Let's make this easy on ourselves. Datetime parse, and we'll say 2001. There we are. I want to pass that date of birth into my query and have it replace the parameter or parameterize the query for me. Because you don't want to inject it manually. That's just something that everyone should be doing. Always parameterize your SQL queries. Well, in Dapper, you just pass it as the next parameter. So set an anonymous object where I pass in date of birth. Now, a couple notes here. Because I'm passing in date of birth as name date of birth, it's automatically going to assume that the name of the parameter I'm passing in or the property I'm passing in is date of birth. This gets mapped to my query. But this is called an anonymous object. It's been in .NET for a little while, but it's not a quote new object feature type. If you have a other case where you have a strongly typed object, so maybe you're creating a class and you're just calling it params, and params has a datetime, we'll call it date of birth. If you had an object like this, you could say, okay, well, params is equal to new params, and date of birth is equal to date of birth. And params is not the best. I'm not going to use it. We'll just call it P. All right. We're not going to deal with keywords right now. Well, P is a strongly typed object. I could just pass that in as well. So don't let me using an anonymous type throw you off. You can pass any object into Dapper, and Dapper is going to take the properties of those and apply them to the SQL query if it's necessary. All right. Let me go ahead and back up here. I'll go ahead and comment that out for now. So let's run through this example and see what happens. All right. So API/Dapper, I hit my breakpoint, and I'm going to say, all right, open my connection, create my date of birth, and I'll call my query with the date of birth. And this returns 1,505 results. So like we were expecting, Again, all the date of births are after January 1st, 2000. So we're doing that query. We're passing in a anonymous object, and it's parameterizing the query for us. So that's one of the nice things about Dapper. It's taking care of all that work for us. All right. Now, sometimes when I do Dapper work, if I'm hitting a database, the biggest inconvenience is creating the object to map to. Sometimes that's hard to explain. But I want to just make a ad hoc query, but I don't want to create the object for it to bind to because it's just a lot of effort. And maybe I'm only returning one thing from the database anyway. Well, you don't have to bind to an object. Well, if I just take the binding off completely, so just query async. Well, query async is going to return a dynamic object, which is really cool. Dynamics also not completely new to .NET, have been around for a little while. Essentially are objects that their type are deferred at runtime, not at compile time. So we'll go to API/Dapper. Oh, I dropped my port. So we'll rerun this query again. Still date of birth. We're going to pass in that parameterized query. It's going to return our list of objects. And I'm going to zoom in for this one. So we look at our persons, we're going to see that I don't necessarily have person objects. I have what are called Dapper rows, and these are all dynamic. The content of them, ID, first name, middle name, so on, those are generated at runtime, and you can come through and you can access them the same way you would any other created object. I could say persons.first first name, and I can get all that data. I can iterate through it with a for each. Just because if I'm not giving it the generic type, it's going to come back as a dynamic, and you can use that dynamic the same way you would any strongly typed object. So if I return my persons dynamic, I'm still going to get the same results. ID, first name, everything's great. The only big difference here is how ASP.NET Core is serializing the JSON. So you can see I don't have the nice camel-cased property names that I'm expecting. And there's a lot of data locking up edge. Oops. All right. Oh, well, let's close that. So I use that often whenever I need, so what's the most useful case there? I need to check a table on the database just for some site settings. And it just returns true or false if a site setting is turned on or if a user's preference is turned on. I don't necessarily want to have a full-blown object for that. I don't want to deal with mapping to that object. I just want to know if I call this query, does it return true or false? And that's what the dynamic results are really good for. All right. I know what you're thinking next. Kevin, you're showing us some really awesome selects, but selects are really just one piece of the equation. What happens if I want to insert new data? Wow, that's a great question. Let's walk through that process. Well, let's clear all of our previous code, and let's assume we're creating a new person object. So var person is equal to new person. We'll give this person first name, last name. I'm going to leave middle name null just because. Date of birth, we'll say not my real birth date. We'll set last login date to date time offset UTC now. Let me wrap that into a datetime parse. And what else am I missing? I don't need to set the ID because the ID is an identity. It's going to get generated for me. I'm not going to set middle name. We'll leave that one null. You know what? I'll explicitly leave it null. I want to take this person. I want to build an insert statement. Well, let's clear our SQL. And creating insert statements are tedious sometimes. So let's just ask SQL to do it for us. I want to remove all this crud. Here we go. Here's an insert statement. So insert it into persons. It will set our parameters. First name, middle name, last name, date of birth, and then last login date. All right, I have my SQL. Now, how do I call this with Dapper? I'll call my connection again. Well, I need to await it. So connection.execute async. Now, query is great when you're calling select statements or you're expecting result sets in return. If you're making any other type of query, so an insert query, an update, a delete, you want to use execute. So for execute, I'll pass in the SQL, and I need to pass in parameters because I have 5 of them that need to get passed in. And for these, I'll just pass in my person object. So I could pass in an anonymous type if I wanted to, but I have an actual person object here. So let's pass that in. And this is going to return the number of rows. So and this is if you're making any SQL insert, update, delete statements on your own, it's always going to return the number of affected rows. So you could do that as a check. If you're doing this insert and the result set is 0, that means the insert didn't happen. If you do an update and the row count is 0, it means the update didn't happen. Same thing for delete. So if it's critical that you're checking to see if your rows are actually affected, always check the result set. Let's run through this again. And we will say API/Dapper. Create my person, and I'm going to execute async, and 1 row returned. Awesome. Now I could go into the database and just search. Oops. Let's just get all persons. There should be 5001. And if we zoom all the way down here in the bottom, I'll zoom in. We see here's Kevin, Griffin, date of birth, and my last login time is UTC now. Actually, hindsight, I shouldn't have used UTC now. I should have used just daytime now, which would have had my time zone on it. That's a bug. I should go back and fix that. But I'm adding my new property. Now, the typical question I give with inserts here is, Kevin, how do you handle bulk inserts? So maybe I don't have just one user or one person I want to create. Maybe I have 10 persons I want to create. Well, there's a couple ways you can solve that problem. There's nothing stopping you from just doing a for each over those users and calling execute every single time. But a little trick with Dapper is if you create a new list of person, and inside of that, I'm going to just make a couple copies. So create the same Kevin again. We'll just create 3 Kevins. There's not enough Kevins in the world, I've been told, so we'll just create more. Okay. And I do new person for all of them. There we go. And let's do some. All right, that all looks right. So I'm going to increment the years a little so we can see the actual differences. And we'll just leave all Kevin. Oh, and we'll change these to daytime nows because why not? All right, so 3 Kevins. Well, I could iterate for each over this list, or I could just take person list and pass that in as the parameter. And fancy thing that Dapper should do for us. Go ahead and call our endpoint. Create our list. So there's 3 persons. We'll hit execute. This will return 3 rows. which if I zoom in, I can show you. So here we go. There's 3. Oh, 3 get returned up at the top. And now if I call that query one more time, we'll zoom into the bottom. Actually, will the zoom work in here? No, it won't. That's all right. But if I magnify, we see Kevin's at the bottom. There's 84, 85, 86. There's all the new Kevins that we created. So if you pass in a list of objects, Dapper will take care of creating the bulk insert on your behalf, which is really useful because I have written code in the past with Dapper before I knew about this, where I wrote my own bulk insert statement using a string builder. And it was a lot of code to generate it. And then I learned about this trick and realized all that code could just get thrown away. So things you learn the hard way. All right. How am I on time? All right. I got about 20 minutes left. Let's see. What do I want to talk about next? Let's talk about multi-mapping. This is a fun little trick. I don't use this very often in a lot of my code. But let's assume that I have my select statement. So we'll copy my select statement back in over here. Actually, we're going to change a little. But I have this phone table over here. And phones, I could join things together. So let's join phone together on the person ID is equal to the ID of a person. So change all my SQL statement. We'll go get the phone number. And then I also have the phone type, or I call it name. So phone number and name. If I run this query, all the phone numbers for individual users, they're in another table. And there's a relationship between them. So you're not putting everything in the one table. It's kind of spread out. And this we'll go through and it'll say, all right, well, here's the user and here's their phone number and the type of phone number that you have. Let's take this and let's see how we handle it over here in Dapperland. Let's see, Mark, I see your question. I have an answer to it. We'll come back to that next because that's a really good question. All right, let's take that query and we'll notice on persons, I have person, but then I have phone. Well, let me map everything together. And I want to tell it, build this object. And this is a 200 level example. So I might screw this up the first time, but we'll just see how it goes. I want to go into, oh, I lost my sample code. All right, let me do this right the first time. We're going to say results is equal to connection.query async. And this generic doesn't take just one type. It takes a person. It can take a person, a phone, and a person. Let me walk through what all this means. So, and this is probably going to tell me to set split on, and we'll split on phone number. Oh, I have to do the mapping. So then I have person and then phone. Okay. I don't think I screwed this up. But this is something I only do in demos. I don't do this in real life. And I have a reason for that, but I just want to show you that it's possible because here we go. Let's run this and see what happens. Oh, and then we'll return results. All right. So the question, always database first, never code first. That's absolutely right. Because never had a good experience with code first, but database first, you're in full control. And you can also bring in people that actually know how to work with databases, and they're not insulted by looking at your code. I think like code first migrations are crazy. I have a different set of circumstances for the way that we do projects. Oh, I forgot to await it. But yeah, always database first. And actually, the way we design our apps is we're not even developing the database first. We'll develop the code structures underneath, but we're always working with in-memory data. And then once we have figured out how we want to use everything, we will go back and write the database implementations against it. All right, let's try this again. All right, did that work? Yes, awesome. So, show you the code. So for Stephanie here, Stephanie has phone number, but it's mapped to an actual phone number object. Now, let me walk back through the code and tell you what was happening. When you make a query, this is called multi-mapping. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to map an object to child objects. So for our case, we're joining a couple tables together. You're always getting back one result set. You're not getting back multiple result set. So we want to take a person as basically our object is split up as a person and then a phone. And we're telling Dapper, with this result set, I want to map the first bit of data to a person. But when I get the phone number, I want to take phone number and everything after it and map that to a phone object. And that gets passed into this mapping query because Dapper is smart, but Dapper is not going to try to be smarter than you. So it's going to ask you, here's the data split up in the best possible way I can figure it out. You tell me how things get assigned. So I have to tell it, well, I want to take that phone object that you split out and assign that to phone on the person. And then I'm going to return a person object. And this is definitely a 200-300 level use case for Dapper. The only time we have used this in a production application is that we had a use case where we were getting back a list of users, and we had a role mapping associated with them. So it was all their user data, and then we had a column that was just roles. And we wanted to take those roles, and we wanted to split them up into an actual list of roles. So a complicated query, a complicated result set, and really the mapping like this was two lines of code split out. If we were trying to do all that work by hand by making multiple queries, it would have been significantly more work. So trying to do this, quote, the hard way would have resulted in much more code. But with Dapper, we can kind of do it in just one call and let Dapper deal with all the results for us. I like showing this because it's come up a couple times, but it's not my favorite demo in the world to go on. Let me come back to Mark's question. What would happen if you mistype a column name in the insert? So first name is uppercase first name in your POCO. Does Dapper care? Dapper does not care. Dapper is going to just look at basically it's going to be case insensitive. So because if you noticed, if I undo a whole bunch of stuff here, which there we go. So undo a whole bunch of stuff, first name, last name, date of birth, but the actual parameters I'm passing in, first name, middle name, last name, those are just going to be replaced. I could do this in any way that I want to. Andrew's right. Yep. this is more of a SQL Server thing than a Kevin thing. Now, let's take that question and let's expand on it a little bit more, because this is another common question I get. And I could talk about this in slides. Do I want to talk about this in slides? I don't know. Yeah. All right. How about this? Kevin, what if? What if on your object, your names are first, middle, and last? And these differ from the columns that you have in the database. How do you set up the mapping there? And this is something that other ORMs do a little bit better. Dapper's position on this right now, at the moment, is if you want to fix the column mapping, the result set needs to match what's on your data type. So if I want my person object to have a first, middle, and last property instead of first name, middle name, last name, my solution to that should be to alias. So alias my columns. That's not, I've never liked that solution. And I've been using Dapper so long, we have just built our data access layer around that concept of, we know that the data coming out of the database is going to have a structure. And if for some reason that structure is different from the POCOs that we use in our app, we'll build DTO objects. Or in smaller cases, we'll just use dynamics and then do the mapping ourselves. But we've run into this case a couple times where we wanted Dapper to, we want to be able to tell Dapper, all right, this first name, what if the name of this, and I'm just making code up, what if the name of this was first name coming out of the database? It doesn't do that yet. There's actually a GitHub issue on Dapper right now where they're discussing that, and they just haven't gotten to it yet. It's supposed to be in the next version of Dapper, but you don't know when that's going to come out. So there's also contrib libraries out there. So I talked about, if you search Dapper in NuGet, there's Dapper contrib, which doesn't solve this problem yet. There's a Dapper CRUD extension, and it will do that, so you can tell it how to change mappings. But it's a lot of people trying to fix it in a different way. I don't totally recommend those, because I like official libraries. I don't like someone wrote something 2 years ago to solve this one problem. I don't tend to go that way. So to pre-answer that question, let's see, Andrew, you're writing a couple things. What do you do with the internal dictionary memory that you generate a lot of dynamic SQL? I'm not quite sure what you're talking about. But let me come to your next question. What do you do instead of a link with Dapper? That is a great question. So you don't have, so you don't really have link support with Dapper. You could build your own link provider around Dapper, but that's a bit of effort. So when you're, it's up to you. You would have to build your own, basically your own expression tree implementation around Dapper. So you're not creating and that's kind of what any framework and others do underneath the scenes. They create that expression tree around everything. In Dapper, you're just making database calls. So if you're trying to create an expression tree where you want to get a list of users where the date of birth is greater than something, and you want to order that by year, well, you have to build all the infrastructure. So that's going 200-300 level of where we are right now. So sorry, that's usually not the best answer. But that's thinking of Dapper a couple layers removed from where it actually is. Dapper is not trying to solve that problem for you. So, Andrew, that's when you hit a memory. So I've never hit a memory leak with Dapper before doing anything. So Dapper, that's one of the things I will give Dapper is that because they're dealing with so much stuff on the Stack Overflow side, they are extremely efficient with memory. So one of the things we can do with Dapper is let me undo a bit here. Just go back to a regular query. You know what? Screw this. Let's just do this. That's all right. So we have our simple select statement. So I had results equals await connection. So this might actually build into a little bit of the link question as well. If I zoom in, you notice I have query async, but I also have things like query first async, query first or default async, query multiple async. I'm not going to talk about that, but these are a couple helper extensions built into Dapper where let's say query first or default. If I'm making this query above as returning a person, well, first or default, I just want the first result. That's all I want. I don't care if there are other results. If I call just query by itself, query async, that's going to go hit the query. It's going to load the entire result set into memory as a buffer, and it's going to return that object. That's not ideal, especially if you just want the first one. So you could call just query first or default async. And what Dapper does underneath the scenes is it goes, gets the result set, doesn't buffer the entire result set, just takes the first result and returns that. Single is the same way. So first or default gets the first result, or if there's no result, it returns a null or whatever the default value is. There's a couple of these helpers built into it. I don't use too many of them. Query multiple async, that one I've used once or twice. That takes a little bit more setup. So if you were executing multiple select statements, which I'm not going to write. Yeah, I'm not going to write them. But if you had a script where select this, then select that, and then select this other thing, you could execute all three of those at the same time. And then you could ask Dapper, all right, map the first query to this object, map the second query to that object, map the third query to this other object. That's a use case I've want a couple times. Let's see, and yeah, they ain't too much more in there for query. How do you ensure testability with Dapper? There's a couple ways I could approach this. I don't necessarily do too much testing of my database layer. What I will do is I will do intermittent testing just to create my APIs. But when I actually go to the database, I'm writing the database implementations. I'm not testing against my database directly. So I'm not necessarily caring about testing against Dapper. What we're doing is we're testing all the stuff around, and then when we actually get to the Dapper implementation, we'll do integration tests on that side. But we're not doing any testing directly against Dapper. Now, this is one of the cases where something like any framework's unit of work concept makes a lot of sense because you could create this. You can basically mock a unit of work, and you can pass that around. So you're not necessarily testing the database call itself. You're testing that the database call gets made. You could, in theory, do the same thing with Dapper. You could mock up a connection and just see if the query gets made when you expect the query to get made. I don't. With the testing we do, like I am not a testing purist. I do testing when it makes sense for our applications, but I'm not going to sit here and tried to make up all the different ways that we could use do testing with Dapper. Any thoughts on using in-memory database provider with Dapper either for testing or other uses? Actually, a really good friend of mine, Kindle, runs a company called Gibraltar, and they have a product called VistaDB. And VistaDB is based off of SQL Server, but it's all in memory. One thing, we haven't done it in a while, but we had a project where we took VistaDB, which has an ADO provider, because it's SQL Server. You use the SQL Server ADO provider to talk to VistaDB, and you can actually mock all your database calls with VistaDB. That is really cool for integration testing, because you could, within a couple milliseconds, stand up the test database, do your testing against it, and then tear it down. I think that's one of the big reasons why we don't do a lot of database testing, is because having standing up and tearing down SQL Server instances for very specific use cases is a lot of effort. But VistaDB does a really good job of that. All right, let me make sure that there were no other big things I wanted to hit on. I talked about batch inserts. So I talked about the insert statements, but that same process works for updates and deletes as well. You're just changing the query that you're passing in. And let's see, store procedures, another thing that we do a lot of. I've learned that when I started trusting the database to do more work for me, that I tended to start writing more store procedures, using views more often, just because you could write code, and like as .NET folks, we always want to write .NET code to do things. But if there's a process where I'm iterating over a result set in the database to just update the database, sometimes it's just easier, faster, better to write a store procedure to do that work for you. So we'll write store procedures that do all the work that we need to, and keep that stuff over in the database. I still go back to the number one rule: let the database be good at what the database is good at. And in Dapper, you could just tell it, well, execute async, give it the name of your store procedure. So delete all users, and then you tell it, well, the kind, command type, sorry. You set the command type to stored procedure. You do that, Dapper executes the stored procedure on your behalf. That's actually one of the small things that's not too hard to do with a regular SQL connection, but Dapper makes it just a little bit easier all around. So stored procedures, that was the last, I think that was the last big thing on my list. Transactions, that's another common question we get, is how do you handle transactions with Dapper? It's the same way you would with regular ADO.NET. You would create your transaction, and you would ask your connection to begin the transaction. So we'll say await. And oh, the one caveat here is I told you Dapper will always open your connection for you. However, with transactions, you have to open the connection before you do any of the work, because the connection has to be open to create the transaction. But then once you have the transaction, you can just pass it into the query. And if you don't, so if you create the transaction and don't pass it in, SQL Server is going to yell at you because you opened a transaction and didn't use it. So that's another nice thing about Dapper, is Dapper doesn't hide SQL Server exceptions. It will just pass those suckers through to you. So you get the raw SQL exception whenever something occurs. I've seen with other ORMs where they try to capture the SQL exception, and they try to give it to you in a little bit friendlier language. But Dapper doesn't. Dapper just says, you had a SQL exception. Here it is. You forgot your transaction. And you know exactly what to go fix. All right. So I do think that's everything. I talked about dynamic results. Andrew posted a GitHub issue. I'm not sure what this is. How to execute a SQL query without any Dapper caching. Ah, gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. And oh, it looks like you have to pass in. All right. So yeah, you're starting to get into like 300 level Dapper, where you're using Dapper more as a pass through to the SQL connection. So a lot of things Dapper will do for you, and then you start getting things where it's like, all right, Dapper will do this for you, but you have to do a little bit more of the heavy lifting. All right. Do you build a repository pattern with your apps? Yes, absolutely. So that's how we do most of our, when we're starting a new project, we will start with repository services, all that good stuff. So we'll basically build the interface, and then we'll build our models of how we want to interact with the data. And we'll actually build tests against those, just making sure that we're doing everything that we think we need to be doing, because we're not building our data layer yet. We're building our data access layer, but we're using fake data just so we can stub out UIs and or APIs. And once we get that to a point where we're happy with it, we will start building out the database. But that's really easy because now we know what our data access layer is expecting, and we just create a new implementation of it and say, all right, well, this SQL call, that SQL call. By this time, our objects, our data access objects, map to tables. So creating the tables is pretty low effort. And then you create the relationships and all that stuff. So it's not a complicated process. It's just we just don't do the database right away. And then you ship the product, and then everything changes, right? So then you go back and go, okay, well, I have never had a simple database design come back to bite me. I have had generated databases come back to bite me because I need to change this, I need to change that. It assumes a mapping I didn't want it to assume. Yeah, a whole bunch of data. So yeah, I think that's all. I'm happy to sit around and answer any more questions that you all might have. But with that, I think we're all done. And you can always email me or ask me on Twitter if you have other questions.
Feel free to shout out any questions if you like, guys.
Yeah.
No, otherwise I think that seems to be it.
Alrighty.
Thanks so much for that, Kevin. That was a really smooth presentation, actually. No, it was awesome. I thought you handled the questions brilliantly as well. So thanks so much. And again, everyone follow Kevin on Twitter as well. And if you are interested, do tag about this event as well. That'd be great. But thanks so much for coming, especially because I know today is boiling. So
yeah,
y'all go get outside.